A listener production.
Hi, Natarsha Belling with you, and welcome to the afternoon edition of The Briefing. Coming up in our deep dive, it's being labelled as the US president's war on the media and free speech. US talk show host Jimmy Kimmel is the latest victim, with his show axed after the comedian commented about the assassination of right-wing activist Charlie Kirk. Donald Trump has today also banned Australia's ABC from attending a news conference in the UK after a Four Corners journalist asked about the US president's family's business dealings. So what does this latest escalation mean for the independence of the media and any high-profile person who publicly criticises or questions Donald Trump? But first, let's check the afternoon headlines this Thursday, the 18th of September. A major win for former broadcaster Alan Jones, with a number of charges against the 84-year-old dropped and downgraded. The sexual assault case against the former broadcaster will proceed without a jury after a Sydney court heard two complainants had withdrawn from the prosecution. Mr Jones now faces 27 charges, including 25 counts of indecent assault and 2 of sexual touching. Some charges have been downgraded or amended, though no explanation was given in court for the changes. Mr Jones has consistently denied the allegations, pleading not guilty after his arrest at his Circular Quay apartment in Sydney last November. The federal government has handed down its long-awaited emissions reduction target. Prime Minister Anthony Albanese made the announcement this afternoon, saying Australia will submit a 2035 target to cut emissions by 62 to 70% to the United Nations.
Our government knows that climate change is real, and we want to continue to seize the economic opportunity that the energy transition offers our nation.
Prime Minister Albanese will travel to New York this weekend for the United Nations General Assembly, where world leaders will update their commitments. And retail giant Kmart has been found to have unlawfully used facial recognition technology on customers in its stores across Australia. Privacy Commissioner Charlie Kirk says Kmart collected the biometric data of tens or hundreds of thousands of shoppers over 2 years until July 2022 without their consent. Ms. Kind ruled the practice was disproportionate and had breached the Privacy Act. It follows a similar finding last year against Bunnings, which had also deployed facial recognition technology in a number of stores. Now it's time to get into our deep dive on the ongoing war on the media under the Trump administration. Jimmy Kimmel's show has been axed after the comedian commented about Donald Trump's reaction to the assassination of Charlie Kirk. President Trump took to his social media platform Truth Social, calling the decision, quote, "great news for America," adding congratulations to the ABC for finally having the courage to do what has to be done. And President Trump didn't stop there, adding, quote, "that leaves Jimmy Fallon and Seth Meyers, two total losers on fake news NBC. Their ratings are also horrible. Do it, NBC." This comes just days after President Trump lashed out at an Australian ABC journalist, now banning the organisation from a news conference. So is this an attack on free speech? And how does this affect the basic function of the media, calling those in power to account? We unpack today's latest developments with Crikey journalist Charlie Lewis. Charlie, thanks so much for joining us. As we know, President Trump has had a long campaign when he has been the US president to have a so-called war against the media. Very effectively, he's called any criticism of his administration or any questions about his administration as fake news. And that's played incredibly well for him as US president, but also his important power base, his MAGA supporters.
Absolutely, yeah. And we're seeing, I think, a real
ongoing and accelerating series of examples of that in just the last week. So obviously we're here to talk about Jimmy Kimmel and the indefinite suspension of broadcasting of his show. But also in the last week, Trump has announced that he's going to sue the New York Times for $15 billion US. He's banned our very own Australian Broadcasting Corporation from attending press conferences while he's in the US, specifically because he was asked questions that he did not like from one of the ABC's journalists, John Lyons. And of course, the Washington Post has fired Karen Attiah, a longtime journalist for them, for posts about the late right-wing activist and media figure Charlie Kirk, who was obviously horribly murdered last week. So we're seeing a series of attacks and also a series of, capitulations from legacy media in the US.
You argue, though, Charlie, that we've seen a very, very different US administration and a very different President Trump the second time round to what we saw previously, where he is loading certain departments with Trump sympathisers, one may argue, to ensure there's almost... Many people are concerned now that there is a loss of freedom of speech and this is not an effective democracy.
Yeah, absolutely. I do think that the relationship with the media during Trump's second administration is a really good illustration of the ways in which the second administration is similar to the first one, but more importantly, and perhaps more worryingly, the ways in which that it's different. The first time, I mean, as you said in your introduction, Trump has never backed away from attacking kind of the media that if he feels that they've not been fair to him, and the phrases fake news and enemy of the people would tumble out very regularly in the first administration. But I think that always felt a lot more ad hoc and a lot more personal, and would often be simply a tweet or a sort of an ill-tempered answer. It wasn't as organized and structured as we've been seeing in the second administration. The second administration very, very swiftly appointed a series of very, very loyal Trump fans to leadership positions across a series of departments, as you say. This included the FBI, the CIA, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, but also the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, which is the broadcasting watchdog essentially in the US. That was one of the earliest appointments he made, and it was a guy called Brendan Carr, who is a very, very explicit loyalist to Donald Trump, had been very partisan in his approach to the position, and had sort of touted a lot of the same talking points that Donald Trump would like, both before and after he was appointed. So when you saw the announcement that Jimmy Kimmel Live, the late night talk show, was to be indefinitely suspended, basically, in terms of its airing, that followed a monologue that the host Jimmy Kimmel had given, where he had made some jokes at the expense of Trump and Trump supporters and their response to the murder of Charlie Kirk. The other thing that it followed was Brendan Carr, the head of the FCC, went on a podcast and essentially said to ABC, the American ABC, that we can do this the easy way, we can do this the hard way. He said that the comments were the sickest conduct possible, and that the company can either find ways to change conduct and take actions on Kimmel, or there's going to be additional work for the FCC ahead. And basically he hinted that the FCC might look at trying to suspend ABC's license on account of what had happened. So this was very much in response to that. So we're seeing a lot more of that kind of behavior from the second Trump administration, where he's using the machinery of the state, essentially, to go after some of his political opponents, whether that's political opponents or in the media.
I guess a lot of people would be concerned whether this was Joe Biden, a Democrat, elected president, or more of a Republican president like Donald Trump. Any type of interference in the media, any stopping of journalists calling the government to account or the US administration. How much is this a concerning escalation in really shutting down any type of criticism of the current administration and, more concerningly, freedom of speech?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as you sort of hint at there, for as long as there's been journalism, as long as there's been a mass media, they have come into conflict with political leaders. That comes with the territory to some degree. I mean, we all remember Tony Abbott, our former Prime Minister, saying that the ABC was on everyone's side but Australia's, and remember Kevin Rudd in the lead up to the election that elected Abbott's, noticing quite loudly that News Corp all seem to be of one opinion on him and things like that. So you see these attempts to undermine unfavorable coverage. You see that quite regularly, but this is a sort of a new situation, I think, in terms of, it's certainly in my lifetime, and I think in modern America, the constant attempts to undermine media via, as I said before, kind of via the armory of the state. So having the FCC, they've also, apart from this recent episode with ABC, CBS have also been targeted by the FCC. NBC have been, all for supposedly anti-Trump broadcasting or anti-Trump interviews that they've run. Alongside that, of course, there's been Trump's own personal, very prolific litigation against media outlets. He's sued. He's announced that he's suing the New York Times. He's announced that he's suing the Wall Street Journal. He's announced that he's suing various networks. The CBS and NBC have both been sued by Trump, and they've both settled for many millions of dollars, which again is, I think that is probably actually a very worrying sign, is that the first time around, another big difference between Trump 0.20 and Trump the first was that you saw a lot more active pushback from legacy media in the US the first time around, a lot more very specific. The Washington Post added "Democracy dies in darkness" to their masthead. We saw a lot of publications receive what was called the Trump bump. They had a big jump in their audience because of worries about what Trump was going to do the first time around. We're seeing a lot more preemptive capitulation, I would say, from publications and broadcasters in the US, and that is a sign that will be that just gives activities like this more credence and tells the administration this stuff is working, and that it gives them permission to keep pushing and pushing and pushing. And of course, that narrows and narrows and narrows the public square and has a huge impact on freedom of speech and also kind of transparency in government.
So what does this mean for the legacy media? And also, we know with Jimmy Kimmel and Stephen Colbert, they were two very well-known comedians that weren't necessarily part of a news organisation, as in they weren't journalists, but the freedom of speech that's the basis of being a comedian, is able to have freedom of speech and to often comment on politics or controversies within one nation, within their own country. What does this say to you about the independence of the media moving forward?
Yeah, I mean, it's always been the case that the legacy media in the US and Australia, and basically everywhere that there is a legacy media, has never quite known what to do about Donald Trump, because nothing appeared to ever really, not that necessarily, you would report things that would end the career of most politicians, and you would find that Trump's base never really particularly minded that kind of a thing. So there's always been this tension of how do you cover a figure like Trump when the normal rules don't apply to him. And the other thing that's particularly sort of shocking about this is that, unlike, say, in Australia, the US has a very explicit codified right to free speech in the First Amendment. It's one of the kind of great tenets of their understanding of themselves as a country. And every candidate, and Donald Trump is included in this, campaigned very much as someone who would protect free speech and someone who would fight for it. So the idea that within less than a year of taking office, that people are now losing their job for making jokes at his expense, essentially, is a huge backtrack on that particular promise. And I do wonder, we have seen a few more things. The first time I've ever seen Trump's base turn on him in any kind of meaningful and kind of sustained way was during the controversy around the so-called Epstein files. That was a controversy that he couldn't seem to make go away. It'll be very interesting to see just how important freedom of speech is to a lot of the people who voted for Trump, and whether this could become some kind of issue for him. I have to say I'm skeptical. I don't believe that it probably will, but we'll have to see how that goes.
Well, I'm glad you've mentioned that, Charlie, because President Trump, one may argue he is winning right now, considering what has happened over the last couple of weeks with him successfully getting payouts from media organisations, being able to fire people. We're not saying it's right, but from his point of view, he is, I guess, successful in his campaign. But we know he is the master of distraction. Is this a very, very concerted campaign by President Trump and the US administration, where they knew they were losing their support with their MAGA power base, to distract from the Jeffrey Epstein investigation, which we know from both sides of politics, that campaign to get answers is certainly stepping up?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, and again, it is one of the it's a recurring one in Trump's case, where the actual concrete actions end and where the distraction begins is often a question you have to ask yourself every time you cover anything that he ever does is, am I covering this because he'd actually like me to be covering this? Am I getting outraged about something that he's very happy for me to be outraged rather than something else? I have to say, I do think, given the context wherein we saw the shocking and senseless murder of a very powerful ally of Donald Trump, I don't think there's any situation, even if he was absolutely sailing along in the polls and he didn't have any kind of issues that he was facing, I don't see any version of that happening where there isn't a huge and very aggressive response from the Trump administration and his supporters. I think that always would have been the case. And to the extent where you could argue that however sincere it is, it's also an element of opportunism to this. They are going after media opponents, but also civil society opponents. They're talking about dismantling non-government organizations. And obviously there's also the ongoing issue of sending the National Guard into Democrat-run states to kind of crack down on so-called out-of-control crime. I suspect all of that probably would be happening anyway. And in some ways that is... In some ways it doesn't matter if that's a distraction. It's still extremely dangerous and concerning.
Yeah, absolutely. We really appreciate you joining us on this very interesting time in history right now. Thank you, Charlie.
Thank you so much for having me.
That was Crikey journalist Charlie Lewis. And that's it for this episode of the afternoon edition of The Briefing. We'd love you to subscribe or follow us on Instagram at The Briefing Podcast, and we'll be back in your feed tomorrow morning. I'm Natarsha Belling. Thanks for your company.